The cellar stank of wet wood, rusted chains, and bodies long unwashed. Somewhere above, the Bavarian sky was weeping through the cracks in the rafters, a steady rhythm of water tapping against stone as if counting down the final moments of a family that didn't yet know it was dying. Down in the prison, Hans, the thief, sat trembling. He hadn't eaten in days. His fingernails were cracked from clawing at the cell walls, and the promise of leniency, just a little mercy, had begun to twist like a hook inside his soul. The guard leaned closer, whispering, "Give us a name. Anyone. Give us something the Duke can use." It didn't take much. The man blurted it like a sneeze. The Papenheimers, they're witches. They made candles. From babies. I saw it. I swear, it was a lie. But in 1600 Bavaria, lies were worth more than truth if they fed the right hunger. Fear, authority, and the unquenchable need for an enemy. The Papenheimers were poor, peasants who cleaned privies and begged for scraps. Paulus, the father, was a traveling beggar and occasional executioner's assistant, a man stained by blood, though not by choice. His wife, Anna, bore the lines of poverty across her back and the weight of 5 children on her bones. They were quiet, unnoticed, irrelevant, until now. At first, it was just a rumor. Whispers in taverns, a story to explain dead livestock, miscarriages, the strange smell that wafted from the woods on stormy nights. But within days, the Duke of Bavaria had heard, and he needed it. The land was restless. War hovered like smoke. Peasants grumbled. Towns feared plague. And Duke Maximilian, I newly crowned, and desperate to prove divine favor, wanted a purge, not of flesh, but of spirit, a cleansing to unite his subjects in fear and obedience. So he sent the order. The Papenheimers were arrested before sunrise. No trial, no warrant. The soldiers smashed the door to their hovel while the children slept. They tore Paulus from the floor, beat Anna until her ribs cracked, and dragged the sons by their hair. Their youngest, only 10, was bleeding from the mouth before they even reached the cart. The youngest girl, just a toddler, screamed until a soldier silenced her with the butt of a spear. They were thrown into iron cages, hoisted onto wheels, and paraded through the villages like beasts. By the time they reached the fortress in Munich, the crowd already knew their names and their crimes, except the crimes were born of panic, not fact. In the dungeons, the torturer's room waited like a mouth. The tools were prepared in advance straps, screws, burning brands. They needed the confessions to fit the narrative. 400 murdered infants, magic candles made of fat, flying through the sky on staves, Anna suckling demons, Paulus consorting with the devil himself. But they had said none of these things. The confessions were built, one scream at a time. Paulus was first. His hands were crushed between stones, his joints wrenched from their sockets. The torturer whispered promises, "Say the words, and we'll stop." But the pain didn't stop. Even when the words came, he confessed to what he didn't understand. He made up names. He invented rituals. Every detail was fed to him by the judges. Each falsehood was another nail in the family's coffin. Anna refused longer. She bit through her own tongue before she would scream. They stripped her, hung her by her arms for hours, burned her soles with fire. They kept her awake for 3 nights, mocking her as she prayed. And when the first confession finally left her lips half delirious, soaked in urine, they forced her to repeat it again, louder, as the scribes inked every lie in neat Latin strokes. The children broke faster. The oldest boy, barely a man, was beaten until his eye swelled shut. "Say your mother is a witch," they told him. "Say you saw her sacrifice a child." He hesitated. They brought in his younger brother, bloodied and bound. "Say it," the torturer snarled, "or he dies next." So he said it, and that was enough. The next morning, the people gathered in the square. The church bell rang not for mass, but for murder. From the windows above, noblemen watched as their judges prepared a spectacle. The Papenheimers would burn, but not before their humanity was stripped piece by piece, until only symbols remained. A warning, a lie made flesh. As they were marched to the stake, Paulus stumbled. His legs, ruined by beatings, barely held him. Anna's dress was torn, her chest bruised and scarred. The boys walked with heads bowed, as if already dead. Behind them came the youngest daughter, silent now, limp in the arms of a jailer. There was no defense, no trial, only confession and punishment. Maximilian watched from a high window, sipping wine. The square below roared for justice, but justice had long since drowned beneath politics and fear. And in the cellar where it began, the thief who named them wept free, fed, and forgotten. The courtroom was not a place of law. It was a theater grand, echoing and cold. The stones themselves seemed to sweat, as if sickened by the lies they had to hold. The air smelled of candle wax, ink, and the faint staleness of blood that had once soaked into the floorboards during earlier trials. A crucifix loomed above the bench, arms outstretched in eternal agony, watching silently as another sacrifice was prepared. There were 5 Papenheimers now, 4 who breathed and 1 whose silence had already been claimed. The youngest daughter had died in her cell 2 nights prior. Her small body had stiffened in the straw, like a discarded doll. The guards wrapped her in linen and tossed her into the cold earth without a marker, without a prayer. Anna had not spoken since. The Inquisitor's priests dressed in velvet and cruelty called her forward first. Her feet left red smears on the stones. Her wrists were raw from the rope, her breasts bandaged, seeping through with brown stains. They asked her if she had fed demons, if she had slaughtered children, if she had joined Sabbaths in the woods with Satan, dancing naked and kissing his anus. The questions were not questions. They were verdicts, disguised in parchment and Latin. Anna whispered, "No, just once." The judge nodded. The torturer stepped forward. A new instrument was prepared, thumbscrews, with a spike added for persuasion. The pain made her vision tunnel. She screamed so loudly that one of the scribes dropped his quill. She confessed. Again and again, until her words were slurred from blood filling her mouth. Behind her, the crowd of onlookers, mostly clerks and nobles, whispered to one another, not about her pain, but about the devil, about the Duke, about their own safety. Because in Bavaria, 1600 silence could mean suspicion, and suspicion could mean fire. It was never about the accused. It was about the power of fear, and fear needed spectacle. Paulus, hunched and broken, was dragged into the courtroom next. The judge called him the devil's hand. They said he'd personally butchered infants, melting their fat into tallow for Anna's candles, that he'd buried still beating hearts beneath the town church, that his sons were familiars, animal spirits in human skin. He tried to speak. His tongue trembled in his mouth like a worm on a hook. Then they brought in his sons. The eldest was barely 16. The younger was 12. Their eyes were blank now, stripped of hope. They had seen what happened when you denied the charges. They had seen fire placed beneath their mother's feet. They had seen Anna scream and collapse and be revived, only to scream again. So when the questions came, did your father command demons? Did your mother drink infant blood? Did you see them fly at night? They nodded. Mechanically, each lie was etched down by scribes with clean hands and hollow eyes. The judge called it diabolical testimony. The priests called it proof. The duke called it justice. What no one called it was murder. Yet even among the court's performance, there were moments when the mask cracked. A young friar, new to the inquisitorial post, vomited after Anna's second session. He was escorted out and not seen again. A scribe trembled so badly during Paulus's forced confession that his ink splattered the margins. He was dismissed. But the trial continued, because it had to. Maximilian's rule depended on obedience, and obedience depended on terror. The court produced an official report: 400 infants, rituals, satanic flights, cannibalism. The testimony was read aloud to the townspeople. Few believed it entirely, but no one said so. What mattered was not whether the Papenheimers were guilty, but that someone was. And then came the punishments before the execution. The spectacle needed layering: pain before fire, shame before ash. They began with mutilation. Anna was bound to a wooden post in the center of the square. Her sons were chained nearby, forced to watch. The executioner, dressed in a red leather apron and iron gloves, stepped forward. He held the pincers long, black, and freshly heated in coals. The crowd pressed closer. Children lifted onto shoulders to see. The first scream from Anna was less a sound than a rupture, something ripped from the center of her being, echoing into every stone. Her sons cried out, calling for her. One of them tried to run toward her, but the guards pulled him back and beat him. They burned her breasts, not once, twice. A second set of pincers clamped down again, tearing scorched flesh from already blackened skin. She did not faint. They would not let her. This moment was engineered, crafted to burn itself into the minds of the townspeople. This is what happens to witches. This is what happens to traitors. This is what happens when you do not obey. After Anna, they mutilated Paulus. They broke his legs with the wheel. Then they made him name other witches real people, his neighbors, his friends. He did, because by then, nothing mattered anymore. His spirit had already drowned in the filth of the cell. His soul had already been carved up like meat on a block. And yet the trial went on, for 2 more days, just to finish the performance. More questions, more lies, more priests pretending to weep as they wrote the deaths into holy record. And in every breath, the Papenheimers became something else, not people, but monsters, not parents, but warnings. Their names were no longer theirs. They were slogans, tools, weapons forged from fear. By the end of it, even those who pitied them spoke of them as demons. That was the true power of the court, not just to kill the body, but to unmake the soul. The sky over Munich was pale with ash before the morning sun had fully risen. Smoke curled low across the rooftops, as if the heavens themselves refused to look down. A stake had been driven into the center of the square, taller than a man, blackened from prior use, encircled by damp straw and bundles of dry wood. The executioners worked in silence, preparing the day's theater with the same practiced motions a priest might use to arrange relics upon an altar. Everything had to be perfect. This was not simply a killing, it was a message carved in agony. The Papenheimers were marched from their cells at dawn, chained together, barely recognizable as human. Paulus limped. His feet were bound with iron shackles that bit into festering wounds. Anna could no longer walk, so they dragged her, the fabric of her dress unraveling in the filth. Her chest was wrapped in rags, still seeping blood and pus from the mutilation. Her face was slack, her eyes open but unseeing. She did not cry anymore. The tears had dried. Her mouth hung open as if still trying to scream but no longer remembering how. The boys stumbled behind them, gaunt and gray, with heads shaved and lashes lining their backs like vines. One of them clutched a strip of cloth, filthy and damp, the last remnant of his sister's dress. He did not speak, did not look up. He had not spoken since Anna's torture. As they reached the scaffold, the square groaned with voices. Hundreds, maybe thousands, had gathered. Farmers, merchants, children on their fathers' shoulders, even noblemen leaning from windows above. Some came to jeer, some to pray, most to forget their own sins, but all came to witness, because the Duke had ordered it, and no one dared disobey. Maximilian himself had sanctioned this execution as an act of divine justice. He had written letters, sent out proclamations the devil's servants would burn. The kingdom would be purified. The rot would be carved out from its roots. But the rot, of course, had never lived in the Papenheimers. It lived in the hands that held the iron. First, they strapped Paulus to the rack laid before the stake. The crowd hushed as his legs were broken again slowly, methodically, with the executioner's hammer. Every crack echoed like thunder. He moaned but did not cry out. Instead, he murmured his children's names. Anna was next. They forced her to stand. Her body gave out, and she collapsed, so they tied her upright to the stake, binding her wrists so tightly that bone turned white beneath the rope. The executioner held her head up by the hair so the crowd could see her face, see what a witch looked like after justice had passed through her. Then came the boys. The eldest was led forward, just 16. His legs trembled so violently that 2 guards had to hold him. He looked at his mother, and his face collapsed. The last thing he screamed before they gagged him was not a curse, not a prayer, just one word, repeated like a broken hymn. Mama, Mama, Mama. The firewood was arranged at their feet, oiled, dry. But it was not yet time. The court demanded more. This was the moment of spectacle. This was where fear became law. The executioner retrieved the iron tongs, long and rusted, their tips black with soot and old flesh. He approached the eldest boy first. The crowd inhaled as one. A collective breath held in dread and fascination. The tongs were clamped onto the boy's bicep. Skin seared. Muscle tore. He screamed until he vomited. They pulled a strip of flesh from his chest and threw it to the dogs beneath the scaffold. They did the same to the younger boy, who had fainted before the second pinch. Then they returned to Anna. One final humiliation. They undid the bandages covering her mutilated chest and exposed her to the crowd. Her breasts were gone burnt, black craters now. The crowd turned, some gasping, some laughing, some crying. The executioner took the iron again and reached for her ribs. She did not react, not even a flinch. The fire had already passed through her soul. When they lit the pyres, they began with Paulus, his body, broken and disfigured, caught quickly. Flames curled around his feet and licked up his legs. He howled as his skin split, as his beard ignited. The fire snapped through the wood like a voice from the devil's own lungs. Anna watched him die with wide, motionless eyes. They lit her next, and the boys last tied to posts nearby, close enough to feel the heat, to hear their parents scream, but not close enough to die quickly. The fire consumed slowly. Fat blistered, hair curled, muscle shrank from bone. One of the boys managed to cry out through the gag, his voice a warped sound, neither human nor animal. It rose above the crowd like a curse, a sound that haunted even the guards. It didn't speak words. It spoke grief, desperation, and betrayal so profound that even God might have turned away. By the time it ended, there was nothing left but bone, ash, and iron chains warped by heat. The executioners poured water on the embers and scraped the remains into sacks. The ashes were scattered in the river, no burial, no stone. The Duke's order was clear. The Papenheimers were to vanish, body and soul. And so they did. Their home was torn down, their names struck from the rolls. The priest who baptized them was reassigned. The neighbors who once shared bread with them now crossed themselves when they passed the square. But the memory clung. In back alleys and whispered prayers, people still spoke of that day. Children dreamed of screaming faces. Women heard Anna's sobs in the rustling trees. And men, drunk in taverns, sometimes wept when no one was looking, remembering the boy who cried mama while the fire rose. It had not been a trial. It had not been justice. It had been a crucifixion. Not of one, but of 5. Burned, dismembered, devoured so that the Duke could rule without question, so that fear could wear a crown. After the flames had died and the ashes were swept into the Isar River, Bavaria did not rejoice. It simply went quiet, the silence of a land that had seen too much, said too little, and now lived beneath the weight of what it had allowed. In the official records, the Papenheimers ceased to exist. Their names were erased from baptismal rolls, their birthplace unmarked, their crimes, however those endured, carved into pamphlets, whispered in sermons, passed down as warnings in schools and catechisms. The children of Munich were told not to stray at night, for the ghosts of baby killers walked the roads, searching for fat to boil into candles. The irony was suffocating. The real ghosts were not the Papenheimers. They were the people who watched and said nothing. They were the judges who quoted scripture while demanding mutilation. They were the priests who blessed the pyres and called it sanctification. In the weeks that followed, the Duke received letters from nobles across the Holy Roman Empire. Congratulations, admiration, even envy. Bavaria has purged the devil. They wrote, "Your Excellency's strength has restored divine order." But beneath the flowery ink, there was unease, because every noble who praised the burnings knew, somewhere deep in their chests, that the devil had not been in the poor family from Schwabhausen. The devil had worn robes, had written laws, had signed death warrants with silk gloves. Duke Maximilian. I was not a fool. He knew the Papenheimers were innocent, but innocence had no value in a state teetering between religious war and civil unrest. He needed symbols, needed ritual, needed blood. And so, after their execution, he doubled down. He commissioned paintings of witches and demons for every town hall. He ordered processions through the streets, where children wore white and held wooden crosses as protective charms. He funded traveling preachers who warned that Satan walked among the poor, and only loyalty to the Duke could keep them safe. The Papenheimers became legend, but not as victims, as monsters. And legends linger. For decades, whenever a child went missing, their names were blamed. When a woman gave birth to a stillborn, her neighbors wondered if she had consorted with the same devils that once seduced Anna Papenheimer. The fire had not just scorched flesh. It had planted a seed of terror that grew in every whispered superstition. But history has a habit of rotting backward. A century later, when witch trials began to fall out of favor, the Papenheimer case was quietly revisited. A few scholars, monks, historians, even a handful of reforming priests found the court records, the confessions, the brutal accounts. One monk, reading Anna's testimony, wept and wrote in the margins, "This was no witch. This was a mother." But no apology came from the church, no restitution from the crown. The Papenheimers remained ghosts, unburied, ungrieved. The only public acknowledgement came in a side note of a forgotten text executed in Munich, 1600, found guilty of witchcraft. Methods extreme, confessions doubtful. That was it. 5 lives reduced to a footnote. And what of Maximilian? He rose and rose again. Within a few years of the execution, he became the most powerful Catholic prince in the empire. He crushed Protestant resistance, secured Bavarian lands, and was praised as the savior of Catholic Europe. His rule was long, revered. Statues of him still stand in some corners of Germany. But his diaries, discovered centuries later, told a darker truth. In a brittle entry dated 6 months after the Papenheimers' execution, he wrote, "They did not scream as long as I expected. The mother's silence was more unsettling than the boy's wailing. I cannot sleep." Another entry, written 3 years later, simply read, "Her eyes, they never closed, not even in the fire." Even power cannot shield a man from memory, especially when the ghosts he created refused to die. And so the story drifted, half remembered, in lullabies, in fireside tales, in the silence of children staring too long at the flames in a hearth. For those with ears to hear, the truth remained, not loud, not written, but present, a quiet rot beneath the foundations of empire. Because you can burn a body, you can erase a name, you can bury a family beneath propaganda, fear, and holy writ. But the smoke always lingers, and sometimes when the wind is right, and the firelight flickers just so you can still hear her, not screaming, just watching, eyes open, mouth full of ashes, beneath the cold stone foundations of old Munich, where cobbled streets have long since buried the past. The Papenheimers remain not in flesh, not in name, but in the silence between the bells. They are not mourned by statues, not remembered by plaques, and no candle has ever been lit for their souls by the church that damned them. But they are there, in every crooked glance cast at a stranger, in every law passed to quiet the poor, in every cry for justice that is swallowed by power. Anna's hands, once used to scrub floors and cradle infants, were tied behind her back as the iron pincers peeled her flesh. Her sons, too young to sin, too old to be spared, watched her burn. And Paulus, who once begged for coins at church doors, died with broken legs and the names of his children on his tongue. Their story is not a fable. It is not allegory. It is fact drenched in blood, masked in scripture, sanctified by kings. And though they were swallowed by the flames of their time, their shadows stretch forward, thin and long, across the centuries, not to haunt, but to remind. Remind us that cruelty is most dangerous when it wears the face of justice, that silence is never neutral, and that even in a world ruled by power, the truth, however scorched, refuses to stay buried. Beyond the fire, beyond the flesh, beneath the stone, they are still watching.